everyone, and welcome to Setting History Straight. We want to start by mentioning that most history is written today from a Greek and Roman perspective. Many of the accounts of the Bible were recorded by ancient historians, but people don't know that. And most of our modern historians have deliberately left out those accounts from our present history because they have an agenda that they do not want the biblical teachings in history. The media and the educators today pass the stories of the Bible off as fables and legends. But I'm going to prove to you that many of the stories in the Bible can be backed up by the ancient historians. On this program, we will be covering left out history. Each week, we will be covering a segment of history that's been left out. So we're going to be teaching the history that the historians today refuse to teach. Now, we're going to start talking about the history of Noah, but before we do that, I just want to make a few comments about Genesis 1, because there's many people out there criticizing the Bible and saying that Genesis 1 was a 6,000-year creation and that the earth is older than 6,000 years. Well, what they don't realize is that Genesis 1 is talking about a recreation of the earth. Now, I'm going to show that to you. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Notice there's no time frame mentioned. Simply does not tell you how old the earth is. Now, Genesis 2, it says the earth became without form and void, and darkness was upon the deep. Now, God says in His Word He does not create anything in confusion. So the earth was not created without form and void and darkness. So we know that some time must have transpired between Genesis verse 1 and Genesis verse 2. And we indicate that there's a strong possibility that there was destruction that took place at that point. Then the rest of the chapter begins to describe the recreation of the earth. What happened on the first day? What happened on the second day? What happened on the third day? You will be surprised how many people do not understand that. And so they discredit the Bible and say, well, you can't believe the Bible because it teaches that creation happened 6,000 years ago. But actually, if they understood Genesis, the first chapter, they would understand that it does fall perfectly in line with what the scientists teach today. So we're going to pick up now, since we mentioned that about the recreation, we're going to pick up on the story of Noah. And that history of Noah in early Europe has been suppressed. Not since the close of the 17th century has it been allowed to be taught publicly. They just stopped teaching it around the 17th century. This suppression of the truth did not happen just in a day. It took years for this to happen. But almost every person during the time of the Renaissance could tell you the story of Noah, his wanderings, his plantation in Europe, and the entire account appeared in many books. Now, we're going to be referencing tonight Berosus, who was a Babylonian historian who lived in the 4th century BC. We're going to talk about the legend of Noah, which is written by Don C. Allen. And if you go to my website, 12 Tribe History, you will see the story of Noah, and you'll see all the references I used and where I get my information for this program tonight. Now, we also are going to talk about Berosus quite a bit and Josephus quite a bit because both of them gave the accounts of Noah. So before the flood, Noah was a great, wealthy, and influential leader. He actually lived in the area of Mesopotamia, and he lived on the banks of the Euphrates River. But Josephus records that he fled for his life to Egypt, and that's where he began his ministry to begin to warn the people about the flood that was coming. Now, at that point, when he fled, that must have been the point that God spoke to Noah and told him that the flood was coming and to start building the ark. So we assume that was the point that he did that. Now, there's an epic called Gilgamesh, which is a old ancient writing, and it was preserved. And we know that that account of how Noah fled is in that epic. So that's one of our history references. Now, Berosus, we mentioned, who was the historian during the time of the 4th century, was chartered by Ptolemy to write the history so that it would not be lost. He wanted it put in his Alexander library that he was creating in the area of Alexandria. Now, most of the writings of Berosus can be found in Corey's Ancient Fragments, which is a book, and starting on page 57, you get the account of Noah. Now, Noah actually traveled along the coastline, and during the day he would come out of his boat and he preached to other people living by the sea, and at night he would retire back to his ship. But we know the story that no one except Noah's family, immediate family, were saved from the flood. Now, after the flood, Noah's sons, which was Shem, Japheth, and Ham, their descendants went and lived in the mountains in Armenia. That's where the Noah's Ark came to rest, and they went into the mountains to live because they were afraid that if they came down, another flood would occur. And so basically, we get the account from Josephus. It said they descended from the mountains into the plains, and they were greatly afraid of the lower land. And so they were afraid to come down. Now, Berosus also talks about Noah finally convinced them to come out of the mountains. And when they came down, there was just bodies everywhere, just strewed all over the earth. And he mentions also that because they were so afraid, that God made a covenant with Noah and his family. And that covenant was shown in the sign of a rainbow. Now, we're going to read Genesis 9 through parts of 9 and through 15, verse 9 through 15. And it says, "And behold, I establish my covenant with you and your seed after you and every living creature. Neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of the flood. This is the token of the covenant which I made between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. I do not set my bow in the clouds. It shall be a token of the covenant between me and the earth, and the water shall no more become a flood to destroy all flesh." So that was a promise. The rainbow was a promise from God that he would never destroy the earth again with a flood. Now, we are told that Noah was perfect in his generations, and so the question comes, how did we get the races? And I'm going to tell you my opinion on how we got the races. Now, Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown is a commentary on Scripture, and they talk about Lamech. Now, Lamech lived before the flood, and he married a woman named Zelda, and he and Zelda had a daughter named Naamah. Now, Zelda was a black woman, and so Naamah was their daughter, and she married Ham. And so I believe that's how we got the races, that they came through the line of Ham. Now, the next question people have is, why did so many people live so long before the flood, and then after the flood they lived shorter lifespans? And we noticed that Noah lived 500 years. He was 500 years old when he had his 3 children. And then he lived to be 950 years altogether. And Shem lived to be 600 years. And Abraham lived to be only 175, which is a lot. But compared to Shem and Noah, it wasn't nearly as long. So you see that the people before the flood lived longer. And there's some belief that the atmosphere was different before the flood, that there was actually more oxygen in the air, and that it was a fresher and cleaner environment. That's one of the reasons why the people lived longer before the flood. We don't know for sure, but we do know that there was a difference in that time span. Now, Noah had 16 grandsons, and he spent many years educating his children and their families. Each of these grandsons became a great race of people, and all a race is simply a family. That's all it is. Now, Shem had 5 sons: Elam, Ashur, who actually established Assyria, Aphraphak, Lul, Aram, and Ham had 4: Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Japheth had 7: Gomer, Magog, Medea, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tyrus. That's quite a few names, but each one of these actually became famous nations, and they lived in different parts of the world. And if you go out in any encyclopedia today, you can look up the Table of Nations, and you find that Josephus wrote about the origins of the people and where they were at his time in history. And also Hippolytus, who lived about 2 centuries after Josephus, he also wrote about the origins of these nations in the Tables of Nations. And it's interesting because our encyclopedias tell that information to us. There's very much there's a lot of knowledge about the different races and the Table of Nations. Now, Berosus, we mentioned before, did record some interesting things about the flood, and he said that the people at that time had twins. And he said the twins had twins, and the twins had twins. And it's really interesting because it didn't take long. The little Earth's tiny population began to be large, and it was necessary to redistribute the population by sending out colonies to different locations. And that was God's plan, and it was going to be directed by Noah. Now, the best we can figure is that this project began around 2261. First, Noah took his sons on a world tour. This original world tour is talked about in Lamar's account. Now, Lamar wrote the history of Noah about 3 centuries ago, and he mentions that the tour took place 80 years after the flood, and it lasted 10 years. And after their return to Armenia, Noah began to send out groups of colonies to various places in the world where God had told him he needed to relocate the people. Now, this account is mentioned, some parts of it is mentioned in Genesis 10:25, and it says, "And upon Eber was born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, and in his day the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan." Now, Deuteronomy 32 verse 8 also gives you the same account. It says, "When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of the people according to the number of the children of Israel." So it's talking about setting boundaries for the people. And it's interesting, in early history, children were named names that had meaning. They were given, not like today when people just give names that they like, but back at that point they actually gave names that had meaning. And the word Peleg in Hebrew means division. The margin of many Bibles point this out. In other words, Peleg received this name because in his day God divided up the earth's surface among the nations. This verse has wrongly been misunderstood to mean that this was the moving and separation of the continents. This is not what he was talking about at all. It was the separation of the nations. Now, Peleg was born to Heber and his wife in Armenia shortly before Noah began sending out the people. So that's why he was named Division. Now, Josephus also describes what went on at that time, and I'm going to read you what Josephus says. He said, "God commanded them to send colonies abroad for the thorough peopling of the earth, but they did not obey God. But they, imagining the prosperity they enjoyed was not derived from the favor of God, but supposed that their own power was the proper cause of the plentiful conditions they were in, and did not obey him. So God wanted to separate the people and redistribute the people so that they wouldn't all be collected in one place. And when he did that, many people rebelled. They were happy where they were. They saw no reason to move. They were happy, and they said, all our blessings that we received, we were able to do it on our own strength. And that's basically what Josephus was recording here. Now, the Apostle Paul backs this up. He backs up this account, and he said, the Apostle Paul says, God who made the world and all that is from our forefather has created every nation of men to live over the whole earth and has determined their times of existence. So we have our times of existence determined by God and the limits of their habitations. So in other words, he chose where people would live. Now, another way to read that is another translation is, and he hath made one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the earth, and has determined their times before appointed and their boundaries of their habitations. Now, Noah began to move his people, and he and his company first went to the region of Hyrcanus, which was an area south of the Caspian Sea, and he left a colony there. And after leaving a colony, he went into Mesopotamia toward Babylon, and where he established some new colonies. And next he went to Africa. And according to the account from Berosus, Noah spent a half of a century on the African continent. Now, I mentioned the book Lamar's History of Travels of Noah, and he actually says that the great patriarch finally left Africa and went to Spain, and he was there 256 years after the flood that he went to Spain, which would be the year of 2110. After 9 years of living in Spain, he went to Italy. Now, it's interesting that he went to Italy, because Italy now becomes the capital of the world. Now, Noah was the first world ruler after the flood. And Italy basically was not inhabited for the first 108 years, but God sent Gomer and his descendants to live in that area. Actually, Noah physically took them there. And Gomer actually ruled Italy first. And he died at an advanced age of 2120. And at that point in history, Ham comes from Africa, and he goes into Italy, and he takes over the colony. And apparently, Gomer's son didn't have enough influence to maintain rulership. And so Ham must have began a process of turning the people away from the teachings of Noah. Both Berosus and Lamar record how Ham had a negative impact on the people. Now, Berosus' account indicates that Ham was a wicked man who was involved in all kinds of sinful practices, and he began to corrupt the people's morals. Now, he also mentioned somebody that was named Sebastius Saga, and he was also ruling in that area. This may have been Melchizedek of Salem that is mentioned in the Bible, but we are not real sure that is who that is. Now, there is a very special reason why Italy originally became the home of religious apostasy in the West. Now, we find that a lot of churches began to start out of Italy, and one being the Catholic Church. It began in Italy. And we also know that that's when paganism spread. Now, everybody begins to think that paganism spread from Greece, the area of Greece, outward. But actually, paganism, in the teachings of paganism, began spreading from Italy and not Greece. Now, The Tower of Babel is the next thing that we want to cover, and that happened at this same point in history when people do not want to move. And it said the building of the city and Tower of Babel, mentioned in Genesis 11, commenced somewhere around 2256, we think. We know it was 5 years after the people began to be moved. Historians record that. Now, Genesis 11:4 mentions the rebellion against God's plan was led mainly by the family of Ham. And Nimrod and his followers, and Nimrod is mentioned in Scripture as a mighty hunter, which we're going to begin to describe Nimrod. But it says that the people at that time in Genesis 11:4 began to say, "Go, let us build a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make a name lest we should be scattered abroad upon the face of the earth." So they did not want to move. Now, the flood ended in 2369. That's an important date for people to remember. It was 131 years later, after the flood, that Noah began to colonize and move the people to different locations. So that puts us at 2238. Now, the Tower of Babel happened began to be built 5 years after the colonization started. So that would have put it 2233. Now, they began to work on the Tower of Babel for 18 years before God stopped them. And the Targum, the Jewish Targum, which is a famous ancient writing, says that the tower was for idol worship, and they intended to place an idol on the top of the tower with a sword. The flood, we know, ended in 2369, and the colonization started 131 years after the flood. 5 years after the colonization started, the family of Ham began to build the Tower of Babel. After 18 years of construction, God confused the languages, forcing the people to migrate to other regions of the globe. Now, the Jewish Targum asserts that the tower was for idol worship, and they intended to place an image at the top of the tower. Now, Josephus had an interesting statement in this connection, and he said, "After this they were dispersed abroad on account of their languages, and went by colonies everywhere, and every colony took possession of the land which they light upon, and upon which God led them." Now, this account from Josephus's history tells you that the Bible account was accurate. So he's backing up the Bible account. But in other words, Josephus is also telling us, by one means or another, through various circumstances, God caused the great majority of the people to end up in the area of the world where he originally intended them to settle. Now, that's how life happens with us also. We wind up in the places we wind up because God places us there, or circumstances because God allows those circumstances. Now, we want to talk about who built the Tower of Babel, and the answer is Nimrod. According to historians, Nimrod was the person who built it, but we want to talk about the Cush and Nimrod and his mother Semiramis. Now, Cush was one of the grandsons, and he took a wife, a striking, beautiful woman named Semiramis. Now, you see her today everywhere, but you don't know you see her. At the Columba pictures, they have an image of a woman holding a torch. That's Semiramis. The Statue of Liberty is Diana, and that was the Greek form of Semiramis. It's everywhere because we're going to get into that they were actually worshipped as gods. Now, the ancient Saxon Chronicles plainly records that Semiramis, or another name for her is Ishtar, was from the lineage of Japheth. Now, remember, Noah had 3 sons, Japheth, Ham, and Shem, and Japheth was actually the elder of the 3. Semiramis was the daughter of Eskenazi, who was the oldest son of Gomer, And now remember, Gomer was the firstborn of Japheth. So we have some history on her, and she was basically about 50 years old when the Tower of Babel was beginning to be built. And so that would put Nimrod basically in his 20s when the Tower of Babel was being built. Now, we have a description of Nimrod, and the description is that he was a warlike giant. He was a very tall, very powerful man. According to the Chinese records called the Bamboo Annals, they believe that Nimrod was their first king, and they called him Shun, S-H-U-N. They record that he was not a Chinaman, he was a barbarian, and that his eyes shone with double brightness. Now, I'm going to read the account of Nimrod from Genesis 10, and we're going to start in verse 8. And it said, Cush begat Nimrod, and he became a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, therefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, Calneh, in the land of Shinar. Now, Shinar is the oldest name for the land of Babylon. But interesting is that the word for hunter in Hebrew has a different connotation. It means to be a persecutor, an oppressor, or a tyrant. Now, Josephus backs that up, and he said he was a grandson of Ham, a bold man of great strength of hand. That means he's physically strong. He persuaded them to believe that it was their own courage which procured their happiness, and he gradually changed the government into a tyranny. He began to be the first tyrant on the earth, seeing no other way of turning people from the fear of God but to bring them into constant dependence on his power. Now, another interesting account from one of the encyclopedias is who Nimrod was in history, and they called him Ninus, and that's N-I-N-U-S. Now I'm going to read you from the encyclopedia what they had to say, historical accounts proving that Nimrod actually existed. Now, the figures of King Ninus and Queen Semiramis first appeared in the history of the Persians written by Tessian, who claimed as a court physician to Artaxerxes to have access to the royal historical records. Tacitus' account later was expanded by Diodorus. So here's another historian, both historians talking about Ninus and the history of Ninus, and that was written in the Persian records, royal historical records. Now, Ninus continued to be mentioned by the European historians up to the 19th century. Now, that's written in the encyclopedia that at the 19th century was the turning point. They stopped putting information in the history books about Ninus. Now, that's because modern historians today do not want people to have a connection to history through the Bible. That's absolutely what's going on here. Now, another historian named Castio Rhodes, who wrote about 200-300 years ago, wrote the history of Ninus also, and he mentioned that he reigned 52 years and that he conquered all of Western Asia in 17 years. Now, many people believe that Nimrod was a black man, and he had some black ancestry because of his grandmother, Naamah, who was half black, but in appearance, he appeared as a white man. And we also want to talk about where he ruled from. He ruled from the area of the Tower of Babel, and that city was called Kish. K-I-S-H. It was near the present city of Babylon. Now, Noah had established a colony in that area, and he set up Shem as the ruler. And then eventually Shem gave that to his son, Ashura. And Ashura became the father of the Assyrians, and that's who basically settled that area. But there's much history about the kings of Kish. Now, Kish is well known by historians, and they know that that's one of the very first places that the kingships actually began. Now, I want to tell you the story of Cush, Nimrod, and Semiramis. And we're going to go ahead and tell the entire history. Now, Cush reigned over both Egypt and Assyria. Now, most people do not understand that the connection with Egypt, but we want to explain that. He mainly reigned from Shinar, but has moved his throne to Egypt the last 30 years. In Egypt, he was known as Mendes. The city of Memphis in Egypt was named after him. When he arrived in Egypt, there were tribes already there, and he became the first king of Egypt. Now, we're talking about Cush becoming the first king of Egypt. Now, you can find this information in the compendium, World Compendium, the history of the Egyptians, and it's fascinating history. Now, there was another group that he did not reign over, and that was the Mizrahims. The Mizrahims settled in the Jas Delta area and lived there for hundreds of years, and they were a totally different tribe, and they were not governed by Cush. Now, meanwhile, Nimrod was driven from Mesopotamia to Egypt by Ashura, because remember, Ashura took over that region, and he pushed Nimrod out. And Nimrod joined his father in reigning over Egypt for 2 years. And then all of a sudden, Cush drops out of history. Now, there's many legends about Nimrod and Semiramis plotting to kill Cush, and that's probably what happened, as they hatched a plot to kill Cush. And Semiramis, remember, also did rule and become Isis in history. We're going to talk about that. Now, while in Egypt, Nimrod reigned for 25 years. Now, he was the second king in the Egyptian king list, and he was called Atheus, and better known as Osiris in history. Now, he was driven from Egypt by Shem. Now, he fled from Egypt to Italy, where Shem killed him. Now, he fled to Italy because remember, there was a pocket of wicked people that Ham had worked with years before that. And so he fled to that region, and there's much history about how he was hacked to death. Now, in the meantime, Semiramis also fled to Assyria and stayed there for 30 years. During that time, the Egyptians were without a king. Once Semiramis determined that it was safe, she returned to Egypt with her young son Horus. In history, Horus is Gilgamesh. Now, Semiramis told the people that she had been impregnated by the spirit of Nimrod, and that Nimrod lived on through Horus. Now, Semiramis ruled over Egypt for 4 years until Horus was old enough to reign, and then he reigned in Egypt for 31 years. Now, in 2094, Horus, who was Gilgamesh, led a group of people into Western Europe to settle it. During that time, Horus left his mother to reign over Egypt, and she reigned for 11 years. He then returned to Shinar to rule until the time of Abraham. When Horus returned to Assyria, he found himself at war with his mother. The king of Armenia had gave her an army. Both the king of Armenia and Semiramis were killed in battle against her own son Horus. Now, the next person in history we want to talk about is Shem. And Shem was also one of the kings of Egypt. And it seems incredible, but we know that this is a fact. Shem ruled in Egypt as the 7th king of Egypt, and his name was Thinis. He was called the old man with the beard, and he basically was the one that divided Egypt into Upper and Lower Egypt. When Noah became ill, Shem left Egypt and took over the responsibilities of Noah in Italy, and then later Ashura assumed the responsibilities over Western Europe. Now, Shem would have normally passed his inheritance down through the following generations, but it did not work this way. Something happened very unusual. All the descendants of Shem died out while Shem was still alive. Shem outlived 10 generations. He outlived all of his sons and grandsons. Now, after the death of Semiramis, the people began to worship Semiramis and Nimrod. They were called Semiramis was Isis and Nimrod was Osiris. For many centuries, people did pilgrimages to worship Isis and Osiris at their burial site. They were buried in Abydos, Egypt, and you can still go there today and see their burial site. Now Syria and Egypt became the center of worship for Isis and Osiris. Now we find a quote from the encyclopedia saying Ninus was the founder of Nineveh, and the historical site of Nineveh is mentioned about the 1800 BC as being the center of worship for Isis or Isitar. Now Isitar was another name. It's actually used in the Bible, meaning Isis. Now these two figures in history have many names and in different languages. Now Ninus was in Germany Mercury, and his wife was Venus. And so you see that their names, they're the same character, but their names change when you go into different nations. Now we know Nimrod today as Sargon the Great. Now if we look at the history of Sargon the Great, we find some interesting things. That Sargon the Great lived in Kish, which was at the time of the Tower of Babel, and we also know that he conquered the western part of Asia, which is exactly the same credit is given to Nimrod or Ninus. So we know that it probably had to be the same people, that Sargon the Great must have been Nimrod. Now we can't leave the story of Noah without examining the proof of the findings of Noah's Ark. And we're going to talk just briefly about that. Most of the scientists today are on board with the recent discoveries. It's been all over the news in the last couple of years. The original discovery was made by a Turkish army captain in 1959, and he was flying around the mountain ranges in Turkey and found what he thought was something very unusual, and he photographed that. And the pictures were later published in Life magazine in 1960. Now in 2008, the Turkish and Chinese explorers from a group called Noah's Ark Ministries International, it's a group of scientists, made the latest discoveries and claims in a press release in Hong Kong. The group is based out of Hong Kong, and said this team found in 2007 and 2008 7 large pieces of wooded compartments buried 13,000 feet above sea level near the peak of Mount Ararat. Now that's basically the same place that we know that the Bible says that that's where the Noah's Ark came to rest. And they returned to this site with a film crew in October 2009. Now, the team says that radioactive dated wood taken from the discovery site shows that the Ark was 4,800 years old. This roughly coincides with the time of Noah's flood, implying that the Bible again is accurate. The location of the sighting has been kept secret for now. Now we read Genesis 8:4, and the ark rested on the 7th month, the 7th day of the month, upon Mount Ararat. This latest finding backs up the account of the Bible. You know, historians today simply do not want to admit that the accounts in Scripture are accurate. They have an agenda. The agenda is to discredit all accounts from Scripture. It is no wonder that there's so many people today do not attend church or believe in God. And if they do believe Him, they do not believe that He has any influence over their lives today. Now, Romans 1:28, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. You know, so many people today have an outside showing of godliness, but they do not want God working in their lives. Many people have a form of godliness but deny God's power. Now we see that mentioned in 2 Timothy 3:5, and it says, having a form of godliness but denying the power thereof, from such turn away. Now We also see reference to this in Jeremiah 17:5. And it says, "Thus said the Lord, cursed be the man who trusts in man, and make flesh his arm, and whose heart departs from God." The only way we're going to resolve some of the problems we have today is if the whole nation turns back to God. People believe that if they can just get the right leader in government, or get the Republicans elected, or get a new president, then they can turn the country around. But our problems are way beyond that at this point. Unless the people return back to God and keeping the laws of the Old Testament and the teachings in the New Testament, there is not going to be any salvation for this country. Now, every week we're going to be covering different segments of history that's been left out. In the coming weeks, we want to cover the true history of the Trojan Kings. Now, the Trojan Kings are actually mentioned in the Bible, and they are a group of kings that have been totally left out, and people have turned them into fables and legends. But we have way too much evidence to prove that these people actually existed. We will be discussing the seventh-day Sabbath in history also, and many people do not know that everyone kept the seventh-day Sabbath for the first 200 years after the time of the Messiah. Even the Catholic Church kept the seventh-day Sabbath. We also want to reveal the true history of the 12 tribes of Israel. We're going to be tracing them through history. We're going to be talking about where they went, when they left the land of Israel, and where they are today. We're going to be talking about the identity of America in history. Who is she? Is she mentioned in scriptures? So you see, we have many programs planned. So all the information that is covered on these broadcasts can be found on my webpage called 12tribehistory.com. Now, you can click on the recent articles, and I will have an article that covers the topic that we discussed today and many other topics. Please feel free to email me if you'd like to make any comments or additional information about the program or other programs. My email will be found on that website. It's lwatson44@cox.net. I would love to hear from you. I also have a book called Setting History Straight, Have We Been Taught Lies? And information on how to order that book is out on my webpage. Now I'm going to give you the web address one more time. 12, like the number 12, tribehistory.com. Now, in summary, we proved today that Noah was the world ruler and he ruled from Italy. We know that the famous Cush of the Bible became the first king of Egypt, called Mendes. We learned the identity of Nimrod. He was Sargon the Great. We know that many of the pagan gods and goddesses stem from the actual history of the first kings of Egypt. We learned that Nimrod and Semiramis became Osiris and Isis, the famous two deities, and they are still buried in Egypt today. The origin of pagan practices stemmed from Nimrod was known as Ninus in history, and he was taught about by the historians until the 19th century. And many of those pagan practices are still with us today. It is time now to close the program. Feel free to email me with any questions or comments you might have. You can go out and review any articles that we have on 12tribehistory.com. We hope you enjoyed the program, and until the next program, blessings to all and good night.